And now a letter from 24 scientists around the world has been released demanding a new investigation into the origins of COVID and demanding that the World Health Organization look into the lab in Wuhan. Gilles de Manouf is in New Zealand. Hi, Gilles.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Look, this is such an interesting letter because it goes much further than just demanding a new investigation, but it lays the groundwork in terms of why denials by the Chinese that this lab could have been involved in any way sound pretty hollow when you take a look at some of the facts. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, some of the facts we're listing there, and we've done an awful lot of research, over something like 10 months now. Some of the facts are fairly obvious. I mean, at best shows that there's some withdrawal of information, sometimes blatant lies too. And that's not really conducive to, things that they're very honest about what they're telling us, without prejudice to what the exact origins are. Certainly their attitude is not really consistent with what we would expect, especially since there are now 3 million deaths,
All right, you're not a geneticist, you're not a epidemiologist, but you are a data analyst from a group now called Drastic, which, as I understand, is an international team of scientists and sleuths attempting to fill in gaps on COVID's origins. What is the background on Drastic? How did this get going?
Let's say that, first of all, yes, I'm a member of Drastic. I'm a member too of what's called the Paris group. And where we're quite different from anybody in both Drastic and Paris group is that we are actually, we've got people from very different backgrounds. And for what we're suggesting here, which is really a forensic investigation of the potential of a lab-related accident, you need people from very different backgrounds. My side, and I'm not the only one in Drastic, my side is more data analysis, getting the data out, finding what the data is, making sense of it. It's pretty much like a standard intelligence or SINT analyst. Basically, you go find the data. Most of it is just available on your Chinese internet if you know how to find it. And you translate it, you look at it, you compile it, and you make hypotheses. And obviously, eventually, you publish your research and you put it out there for discussion.
Let's talk about data, because what's important in terms of you being able to assess and access data is the fact that the Chinese had this lab in Wuhan, which was for most of the time was online, I understand, before COVID broke out, and their sampling of bat viruses and what they were doing with them was at one point public. What happened to that?
It wasn't fully public. Let's say they had a database, actually they had 15 databases, and one was a big one, the main one was very important. And these databases are a private and a public portion. The public portion was typically viruses and samples that they felt was okay to actually render public, but they had a private section, and the private section was typically for what they were working on. Especially they didn't want people to actually look at what they were working on or what they could still work on and go and write their own papers. So, and scientists are like this. They're not going to give their raw materials that they went and, sampled in some mine or other places. So
but is this the one that had 22,000 samples and virus?
Exactly. So some of them were public because they already published about them or it was okay for them to release them. But, at all time, they had a section which was private. And that private section, you had to ask a permission. You had to ask a very specific question to them, typically to Xi Zhengli, and ask, okay, can I access the data? What do you have there? And maybe they would let you know what they had there. But typically, scientists do not want someone to come in, look at what they have, write a paper, and run away with the papers. That's not the way.
Okay. If you had the password,
yeah, you needed basically a password. So all these new viruses that they sort of were working on, typically anyway, were not made public. They were in the private section. But a lot of things were still made public because they had published about it or they thought it was okay to actually, release it. But what happened effectively in September 2019, actually on the 12th of September 2019, is that database, which actually had been funded partly by the European community under a product called EVAG, that database just was taken offline, and that's it. And all the 15 databases, part of that family of databases, were taken offline. Today, there's nothing left of any of the data of the WIV. Nothing is online. It's all gone.
It doesn't mean it's gone, but it's not online.
It's not online. You can't access it. They're not going to tell you when they're going to release it. They're just telling you, oh, sorry, because they're just telling you that some hackers were basically trying to get to the database, so they took it offline. And that makes no sense, because when they said that, they said it was during, they had to take it offline during the pandemics, but actually they took it offline.
22,000 samples of of virus sequences, including 15,000 from bats, and covered 1,400 bat viruses, is taken offline in September. This is months before COVID is officially announced by the Chinese in terms of their cases in December. Is that by itself a little suspicious?
Well, it certainly is a bit odd. Now, you have to, when you look at, it's all about data. You collect the facts, you collect the information, and you try to interpret it. Sometimes it's better not to try to push it too far. I mean, in this case, maybe there was some good reason for them to take it off. Possibly, that's possible, but I cannot conclude that today. What is sure is that they never put it back. And, about 3 million people dead. Everybody wants to have access to this to actually check it out. You don't have access. I mean, that's the basic stuff you would ask, is that, okay, give us access, put it on a USB drive if you want, if you're afraid that someone is going to hack it.
I mean, I don't want to go too far down this conspiracy idea with the Chinese in this database, but what's important here, in order to understand it in context, is that they are doing experiments in this lab that involve coronavirus sampling and sequencing, and they are at one point strengthening those viruses in their experiments. And now people want to know, well, did that lead you to COVID-19? Show us your data, show us what you were doing inside the lab. The database has been taken offline and that information has disappeared.
Yeah, there's that. But remember too, that what are the Chinese telling us today? They're telling us that we got to go and sample. We got to go and sample in Thailand, in other countries and everywhere. But let's just think about it. They already have a lot of samples available in that database, and they're not public. So before they tell us to go and sample, why don't they just show us what they have in the database? I mean, that's not very difficult,
Why didn't the WHO ask for that and demand that? And how could the WHO come to a conclusion that it was unlikely that the lab was involved in the outbreak of COVID-19? How can they come to that conclusion?
That's a different issue. You need to look very objectively just at the facts that you see. I mean, we see a database that has been taken offline. We see a database which is essential for understanding what's going on. We see the WHO and China saying we need to go and sample. So all I have to say, well, before we go and sample, show us what you have in that database. We know, by the way, that they have a family of about 8 viruses in that database sequence, which are very close to actually RAT-TG13, the closest virus known to date to SARS-CoV-2. So, I mean, we already know we have very close viruses there, very close to SARS-CoV-2 in a way. Why don't you just show us what you have? What's the point of going to Thailand, spend 10 years to try to get something which may never be as close as that? Just show us what you have in the database. It's just common sense. No, what happened during the sort of visit of the joint team in Wuhan is that basically, very simply, Peter Daszak just told the teams that he knew what was in the database, and there was no point looking at it. Only problem, he said that the database was actually an Excel spreadsheet. No, I just don't know. You can put sequences which are 10,000 letters long into a spreadsheet. It makes no sense whatsoever. You don't. I mean, you need.
All right, this is Peter.
Information system.
Let's stop here. Let's stop for a second. You're referring to Peter Daszak.
Yes,
He's
that's
involved in the WHO investigation,
right.
and he's also involved in Lancet's COVID-19 Commission. These are the only two investigations now that are running a year and a half after the outbreak of a world pandemic.
Yeah.
And he was involved in funding this lab from the United States. He was involved in funding this lab.
Yes, he wasn't the only one. The NIH
some would argue he has a
well.
very severe conflict of interest in being involved in any investigation of the lab.
Well, I think that's correct. But, you know, I mean, people will tell you that, you know, most virologists today would have a conflict of interest in one way or another, because the fact is that most of the cutting edge research was being done in Wuhan on coronaviruses, for the simple reasons that basically, you know, for a few years they couldn't do it in the States and anywhere else. So basically, you know, the same way that we export, you know, a lot of our stuff to be done in China, then that research was done in China. But you know, with money from the U.S. taxpayers. So yes, obviously.
These are gain of function experiments.
Well, gain of function is one way, but it started maybe not with gain of function. It started with traditional research, and it moved into effectively the latest trends were effectively in 2018, 19, were effectively very explicitly moving towards gain of function. But once again, this is not just Peter Daszak that decided to go and do that. It's, you know, the NIH which decided to go and do that, and I was done with, you know, U.S. taxpayers' money, because we offloaded, you know, the U.S. basically offloaded its research to China on that. That's very clear. And yes, there's certainly a conflict of interest there. I mean, you could say, but there are two ways of defining a conflict of interest. One is a theoretical conflict of interest. The other one is a very practical and realized conflict of interest. And I think that when someone goes and says that, you know, the database is fine because actually it's an Excel spreadsheet and there's nothing to look at, you know, there's nothing in it of any interest, especially when he has no access to the, you know, the sort of portion which was password protected anyway. And when it's not an Excel spreadsheet, because you can't ever put all that data in a structured way in an Excel spreadsheet anyway, it makes no sense whatsoever. That someone says something like this in such an investigation, for me, is a bit surprising. And I may ask, is that a, you know, theoretical conflict of interest or a realized conflict of interest?
In the letter, you are not only asking for access to the lab, but you want access to the Mojang mine, where in April 2012, there 6 men contract severe pneumonia with COVID-19-like symptoms. They are sent to hospital. 3 of them eventually die. And those lab samples then are worked on in the Wuhan lab. Is that correct?
That's correct. So what happened is that 2 died quite early. And after the second one died, they called Zhongnan Chan, which is basically still and was at the time the specialist for any unknown pneumonia of unknown cause. He was the hero of SARS. And they called him in. And he ordered effectively that the 4 patients that were still alive, one of them for not very long, but the 4 patients that were still alive, he ordered them to be tested. And some of the tests were done effectively at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And actually they came back positive for IgG, basically, which means, you know, past infection with some coronavirus.
With some coronavirus.
Yes. So
and where is that information now, and the sequencing that was done in the lab with that information afterwards? Because that seems to be a smoking gun in this.
Well, it's not, doesn't mean sequencing was done. The test was done, and, you know, they got little sort of receptors which actually match the target in this case. You know, that would be the SARS-like coronavirus, and that basically tested positive. To go back to your question, you know, this is again a case of, you know, the WHO and China is saying we need to go and sample, and China is saying, well, let's go and sample in Thailand and East Asia and so on. But if you look at it, actually, where are again the closest virus to SARS-CoV-2? Well, they're all from that mine. So before we go in Thailand, why don't we go back to the mine? I mean, the first thing we would expect
the mine where many coronavirus samples were collected from, and where there is a documented outbreak.
Where all the closest ones are.